Hampstead Way is a delightful street in North London. It has plenty of greenery, it has gorgeous arts and crafts style houses, and then there's this ugly thing. An electricity substation, judging by the warning signs, but there are a couple of clues that all is not as it seems. First of all, this looks a lot like a ventilation tower. And then there's this sign in the Johnston typeface, exclusive to Transport for London. What we're looking at is the entrance to North End Underground Station. A remarkable station in many ways, and one that was never actually opened to the public. And one that would eventually become a key part of London's Cold War defence network. North End is on the Northern Line between Hampstead and Golders Green. It was built by the Charing Cross, Euston and Hampstead Railway, which was better known as the Hampstead Tube. Now, the Hampstead Tube was part of the Underground Electric Railways of London empire, headed up by the charismatic but dodgy Chicago businessman Charles Tyson Yerkes. Yerkes had bought the Hampstead Tube up when it was little more than a concept, and he immediately set about putting his own spin on it. The Hampstead Tube was initially supposed to terminate at Hampstead. The clue is in the name. But Yerkes wanted to take things further, literally. The story goes that he took a carriage out across Hampstead Heath, stopped it in an apparently random spot, and declared that he would build a station here. And that was Golders Green. Well, as with a lot of these cute stories, that probably didn't happen, but as far as railway professionals in Britain were concerned, he might as well have done it like that, because there was nothing at Golders Green. In Britain, railways were built from one place to another. But in America, suburbs grew up around the railways. You could build a railway to the middle of nowhere, and within a few years it would be serving a town. And that's what Yerkes hoped for here. A town centred upon the station. And that's what he got. He hoped that the same thing would happen at North End, which was authorised in 1903. Now, I call it North End, but the people working on it knew it as Bull and Bush after the nearby pub. It might even have been called that if it was completed. It didn't really matter. The place would be called whatever the station was called. That was the idea. We don't know exactly what the station would have looked like, but here's an artist's impression what I done based on the plans. It would have been the deepest station on the entire tube network, or at least the furthest below ground level, at a depth of 67 metres or 221 feet. The major landowners around here were Eton College, and UERL bought 2.5 acres off them. Eton insisted that the station should be approached via a side street, Hampstead Way. Fine, said UERL. And word started getting out that there was to be a tube station near the old Bull and Bush, and developers started showing interest. Everything was looking good until Yerkes' plans were thrown into disarray, as a result of a conversation he'd had 7 years earlier. In 1896, on a Baltic cruise, he'd run into a philanthropic couple, Samuel and Henrietta Barnett. In a letter to his brother, Samuel described Yerkes thus: "One first-generation man, as he calls himself, is most amusing. He has made a great fortune in 3.5 years, and is now educating himself. He is typical of what a Yankee is thought to be, and proposes to convey all London about in tunnels." In Henrietta's biography of her husband, she notes that the system of underground travelling would cause the erection of a station on the western edge of Hampstead Heath. The trains would also bring the new builder, and it required no imagination to see the rows of ugly villas such as disfigure Willesden and most of the suburbs of London in the foreground of that far-reaching and famed view. Therefore there was nothing else to do but enlarge the heath. And that's just what she did. In 1903, she and the Hampstead Heath Extension Council began negotiations for the purchase of 80 more acres of land, to be preserved in perpetuity as open space. And the following year they succeeded. The Hampstead Heath Extension remains in place to this day. Despite having foiled Yerkes' plans, Henrietta was actually in favour of the station. It could bring visitors from all over London to benefit from the green space at an affordable fare. But UERL's investors weren't so sure. Weekend and holiday traffic was all very well, but they wanted commuters. They wanted thousands of passengers every day. They weren't going to get that if there were no houses around here. Meanwhile, there was also opposition from local residents who came up with some frankly bizarre objections to the tube. One was that the tunnels would cause the groundwater to drain away and the heath to dry up. Another was that the hundreds of visitors coming from North End Station would erode the soil. They suggested building it further away, basically right next to Golders Green Station. All of this opposition seems to have had little effect on the actual plans. Regardless of everything, UERL worked fast and construction of the station got underway. It would have consisted of a pair of platforms reached via 2 lifts from the booking hall, this being 7 years before the introduction of escalators to the tube. What would happen at street level was somewhat uncertain. The exact position of Hampstead Way took a while to be decided upon. As it became clear that Mrs. Barnett was going to get her way, planners scaled things back. There would only be 1 lift shaft. And in 1906, they just decided to call the whole thing off. In 1927, the land at street level was sold, and in 1935 the platforms were demolished. The station saw some wartime use as a document store, but it would be in the 1950s that it would finally gain a permanent purpose. In 1939, floodgates had been installed at a number of stations along the underground in anticipation of wartime bombing, to protect the network in the event of a tunnel being flooded. These could be controlled independently or from a central panel at Leicester Square. On VE Day, the threat of German bombs ended, only to be replaced with a more frightening prospect, the threat of Soviet atomic bombs. So between 1953 and 1957, more floodgates were installed, and the decision was taken to build a more bomb-proof control room. North End was the perfect candidate. The tunnels were already there, it was a long way out of the city centre, and perhaps most importantly, it was very, very deep. In secrecy, a shaft was sunk for a spiral staircase. A blast-proof 2-storey room was installed and the platform area was sealed off from the track. A ventilation shaft was put in and both this and the spiral staircase were also blast-proofed. The building at the top was disguised as an electrical substation. A D-notice from 1982 states that it would be damaging to the national interest to publish details of the underground floodgates that are not in public view on the London Underground railways, which led to press speculation that something more sinister was going on down there. It should be noted, though, that by 1982 North End wasn't much in use. Testing of the system slowed down in the early 1970s. The nuclear early warning system was maintained and indeed tested into the 1980s here. But thereafter, all activity ceased. The circumstances for its use had never arisen happily, and never would. The general attitude towards nuclear war had shifted somewhat, from the 50s idea that it would just be a bigger version of the Second World War, to the belief expressed by the likes of Threads and When the Wind Blows that it would simply mean the end of civilization. In the face of such an existential threat, floodgates aren't going to do much good. In 1982 the Thames Barrier was completed, which was considered to make most of London's previous flood precautions redundant. As the 1980s progressed, the Cold War cooled off. In 1989 the Berlin Wall fell, and in 1991 the Soviet Union collapsed, ending the threat of nuclear attack. Well, you know, for the time being. The floodgates are believed to have largely seized up. What now? Well, as you can tell from this video, North End is no longer a secret. Its main purpose now is as an emergency exit and access point to the Northern Line. Still, for a station that was never finished, it's had a surprisingly large impact. If it hadn't been for Yerke's plans, Hampstead Garden suburb would never have been built, nor would the Heath extension. It was a vital, but fortunately largely unused, part of London's civil defence. And now it's just a discreet, shabby and somewhat out-of-place building in a back street in Hampstead. Well, I hope you enjoyed this secretive tale from the Tube. If so, please do leave a like and consider subscribing for more. I would like to thank my donors on Ko-fi, on Patreon, and here on YouTube for your generous support. You are the concrete lining to my spiral staircase. And I'll see you all again very soon. Cheerio.